This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
This is the Roger Stone Show, presented by Colonial Metals Group.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone.
Now, here's Roger Stone.
Welcome back, folks. This is the Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Audio Network. The man with us now, Ken Khachigian, he's actually the man relied upon by both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan to help them to the White House. Senior to me and someone I have enormous admiration for. He has written a spectacular new book called In Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. He was a trusted advisor, speechwriter, and advisor to both Presidents Reagan and Nixon. He saw it all, the high points and the low. This book is amazing, folks. I cannot put it down. I'm about halfway through it. I commend it to you. You can find it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, Target, Walmart. After this interview, you're going to want to order your copy immediately. Ken Khachigian, welcome to the Roger Stone Show.
Thanks, Roger. Always great to be with you. Thank you.
You have written an extraordinary book here because you are an eyewitness to history. You started in politics, as I did, with Richard Nixon. You got to see him up close. He was a very buttoned-down character. People don't recognize that, for example, he played the accordion, the violin, the saxophone, the clarinet, and the piano, as well as, I think I said the violin, but he couldn't read music. He was an enormously disciplined person about what he ate and drank. He was deeply interested in world affairs and politics, but despite his tragic crash in Watergate, he worked his way back through a series of best-selling books on foreign policy to be a respected advisor to the presidents after him, particularly on the issues of China and Russia. I was, like you, there for his funeral at the Nixon Library, and 4 presidents saluted Nixon. It was interesting that it was Bill Clinton who said it was time that Richard Nixon be judged by the totality of his incredible record. This was a man who ended the war in Vietnam, got us a strategic arms limitation agreement with the Soviets, desegregated the public schools without bloodshed, unilaterally saves Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War over the objections of Henry Kissinger and the national security apparatus, launches the war on cancer, gives us the 18-year-old vote, ends the military draft. This is a real solid record of accomplishment when you compare it to, say, I don't know, Barack Obama. You see how truly great Nixon was, yet his great accomplishments unfairly buried in the ashes of Watergate. So the question that I sometimes get asked, but I will ask you, what was he like as a person? What was it like to work for him? Because he has this kind of cold image that I think is created by the media of his day and since, that hated him since he correctly proved that Alger Hiss was in fact a communist spy when the Soviet Union fell, and we could actually get the KGB records. There it is, proof that Nixon was right. But talk to us about Nixon, the man.
Well, he was just an incredible personality to work with. I mean, just when I returned to San Clemente with him to work on his memoirs and the David Frost interviews, help him resuscitate after Watergate and his resignation. There were such incredible hours of conversation, and he was an actual, just a fascinating raconteur of stories of just intriguing, fascinating years of history. Just everything that spilled out of his mouth was historical, because it wasn't any casual conversation with him. The things we would talk about would go back to his campaigns in the 40s and the 50s, and his time as vice presidency with Dwight Eisenhower. My responsibilities at the working on the memoirs dealt with the political side of his career, and so we dealt with all the campaigns and had to do away with all the cliches about his career, because we had to clear up some of the myths about that plagued him, because he was actually brutalized by his opponents. Like Helen Hagan Douglas was one of the most vicious campaigners against him. But anyway, sitting down with him all those years was he was a great conversationalist. He knew a lot about so many things, not just about politics, but as you say, about sports and everything else. And he was always asking about my family. I was always concerned about my family. I had two little girls, and he didn't always want me to work late hours. I'd come in on Saturdays, and so he wanted me to take time off. And so he wasn't the cold, distant person that a lot of people always think. And one of the stories I always like people to know is that he, especially, there was a very warm period of time that I like to recount about when Hubert Humphrey, his adversary in the 1968 campaign, when Humphrey was dying of cancer, very difficult, horrible cancer he had, and the two men who were just very active opponents, and their campaigns were very tough against each other. They reached out to each other, and Nixon reached out to Humphrey, and I was in their office when they had these conversations, and they wrote letters to each other, and Nixon comforted Humphrey, and Humphrey comforted Nixon after the resignation, and Nixon comforted Humphrey after the when he lost to Kennedy after a primary, and running again for president, and it was just a remarkable relationship that you can't even imagine. And then Nixon put down the phone and he said, Hubert, we're going to treat Hubert well. He was never mean. He was a tough campaigner, but he was never mean. Now, this is a side of Nixon that nobody ever knew, Roger. And so I don't know if this answers your question, but there's so many different facets to Nixon that people never understood. And I will say one other thing, that there was a remarkable comeback, a spirit of comeback in him after Watergate. When I sat down with him for the first time, when I returned to San Clemente, and I was 29 years old, and I was heartbroken, and I thought my world had ended, and of course and his world was pretty much ended. The most precious thing he'd worked for in politics, and he had no job, he had no income. They were going after him for back taxes. They were trying to disbar him in California and disbar him in New York, and there were subpoenas flying back and forth still. The press were still hectoring him. The special prosecutors, before the pardon, still wanted to prosecute him. And we sat down, and and I thought he'd be in despair. And he said, Ken, we can't look back. You can't get down, and we always have to look forward. So, and I was there looking past the shoulder at the Pacific Ocean. It was so beautiful that day, and I thought, oh my gosh, here I am. I thought my life has ended, and he wants me to look forward. And Roger, that was one of the most remarkable moments of my life, I have to tell you.
He would often say, never look back, always look forward. Folks, we'll be right back with Ken Khachigian, the author of In Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon, an incredible new book. In just a moment. We'll be right back, so don't touch that dial.
This is The Roger Stone Show.
Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump.
They went after a guy named Roger Stone, who's sitting in the office. And I'll say this in front of Roger, he's no baby. And right now, he's cleaner than anybody in this place. No, they treated him very unfairly.
All of these presidents relied on one man to secure their seat in the Oval Office. That man is Roger Stone.
Roger Stone.
This is The Roger Stone Show, presented by Colonial Metals Group. Now, here's Roger Stone.
And we're back. We're privileged to have with us Ken Khachigian, who was a speechwriter, a trusted advisor to presidential giants Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. He's written an extraordinary new memoir, In Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. It's so much fun for me to read this book because there are so many events that I was aware of. It fills in a lot of blanks for me. In many cases during the 1984 campaign, when President Nixon was advising President Reagan, often using Ken as a mule for his brilliant memos and his passing on messages, I got to play the backup. I had copies of many of your memos, Ken, and many of the memos that you first passed to from Nixon to Reagan. Nixon, the consummate political strategist, a man who loved it. Reagan, who I think didn't love the nitty-gritty of politics, more interested in the big picture. I want to focus for a moment on probably President Reagan's most famous speech, the famous speech in which he challenges Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. It's depicted in this new movie, Reagan, which I think is excellent, produced by Mark Joseph and starring Kevin Quaid. But what is how did that whole speech thing go down? Where do those words come from, Ken? I'm curious about this.
Well, that was Peter Robinson, a very talented young man who's now at the Hoover Institution. You know, sometimes words are typewriter. We had typewriters back then, Roger, instead of computers, but and laptops. But our typewriters can be smarter than we are, and speechwriters have floating in their heads phrases that try to affect policy. And we're, as speechwriters, we're not supposed to try to change things or change policy, but sometimes we try to make the president affect the president's policies. And I think what he had in mind was the president had a reputation for being a strong anti-communist over the years, and he was in communications with Gorbachev over these summits, and the Cold War was sort of immovable at the time, and probably I think there was a sense that maybe this was the moment where you could really make some difference with some rhetoric, and this the phrase struck this young man, and he inserted it into the draft of the speech. Now, as I've reconstructed it in conversations, this went back and forth. Now, as you can imagine, the State Department never likes conflict. You know, they're all, we don't want to offend anybody. You know, we don't want to get the Soviets, the Russians angry with us. We don't want to stir the pot. We don't want to shake things up, and they're all diplomats. But sometimes you have to turn the table over. And so there was a big back and forth of this, and I think there was efforts to take the language out of the speech and put it back in and take it out and put it back in. But the main thing is that there's one person who makes those decisions at the end of the day, and that's the president. So once he had the opportunity to see the language and make the decision himself, he decided, look, that's what I want to say, and it's going to stay in. And it did. And we're happy that it did, because it was one of those ringing phrases that will resonate forever.
If you believe the movie Reagan, they have the actor playing George Shultz, who had served as Labor Secretary under Nixon and Secretary of State under Reagan, trying to talk Reagan out of that line, saying it would undo decades of diplomacy. Do you believe that to be accurate?
I don't know if it's precisely accurate. I think it's a dramatization, but I don't think it's far off the mark, honestly. I think it represents the State Department's point of view. Whether he said it reverses decades of diplomacy, that may be an exaggeration. But I think Schultz was known to want, he was urging very stronger diplomatic relations with the Russians, with the Soviet, at that time the Soviet Union. And as you know, President Nixon viewed Schultz as taking a much softer line in all the negotiations with Gorbachev, and he was very much worried. In fact, he shared those in letters to me. I didn't reprint those letters in whole in the book because they were confidential, but I did share some of the sentiment that President Nixon shared, because he felt that Schultz took too much of a softer view in his relations with the Soviet Union.
All right, we have to take a quick commercial break, so don't touch that dial.
It's the Roger Stone Show on 77 WABC. Here's Roger Stone.
Welcome back. I'm Roger Stone, and this is the Roger Stone Show here on 77 WABC Radio. We are joined now by Ken Khachigian. Ken served as a trusted speechwriter, confidant, and strategist to numerous political legends and presidential giants, including my two favorites, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. Whether it was in the Oval Office on Air Force One, at Camp David, or at the Western White House, Ken Khachigian was an eyewitness and insider to some of the 20th century's greatest historical moments. He has written an incredible book, In Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. I had it overnighted to me from the West Coast. Folks, I cannot put this book down. We're going to tell you later where you can get it. But Ken Khachigian, welcome so much, and thank you so much for joining us on the Roger Stone Show.
Hi, Roger. It's been too long since we've talked. Good to chat with you.
Well, you are clearly doing very well. This book is an amazing, amazing achievement. Our experiences with both these presidents are slightly different. I was a veteran of the 1976 Reagan campaign, along with Paul Laxalt and Lynn Nofziger, John Sears, Charlie Black, and others. It was indeed a ragtag band, but solely because of the qualities of Ronald Reagan as an extraordinary communicator and candidate and his deep commitment to principle. We made a race of it, got to the convention still in contention. And when it was over, many of us thought, well, we loved Ronald Reagan, but that was it for him. I never believed that. In fact, in retrospect, it was, in my opinion, his 1976 bid for president that laid the groundwork for his 1980 victory. But you had an intimate relationship with him. You spent far more time with him than I did. I think that he is greatly underrated, and of course the historians, who are mostly left-wing academics, now seek to denigrate his leadership style and his presidency to the detriment of the true historical record. Tell us about the Ronald Reagan you knew.
Well, that's interesting you bring up the 76 campaign, Roger, because as you read in the book, I witnessed the 76 campaign at the knees of Richard Nixon. We were at the Western White House, and of course we couldn't participate because he was recovering from his post-Watergate resignation. So we watched the 76 campaign. He and I spent hours and hours and hours watching that campaign from afar, and I would feed him information, much of it from the two campaigns, as Reagan battled Ford. And what I learned during that whole process was Nixon pointing out all the different strengths and weaknesses of the candidates. And one of the things that you just point out, because you said that you saw Reagan being able to recover from that 76 campaign to run again, is that Nixon pointed out to me during those hours and hours of conversation in San Clemente all the strengths of Reagan as a communicator and all his abilities to go over the heads of people and how strong he was and what a fight he was making against Ford. So that takes me to your question about what it was like to work with him. Well, when I joined him in 80, it was about this time exactly 44 years ago that our campaign wasn't doing all that well. It was not floundering, but it was sort of treading water. Carter was ahead in some of the polls, and we were ahead sometimes, but Carter was doing rather well. He was the incumbent. He had a lot of strength, and despite the fact that the economy was in horrible shape and inflation was high, inflation was at 13%, mortgage rates at 18%, unemployment hovering around 8%. We had hostages, American hostages in Iran. But the fact is that they were portraying Reagan as a reckless cowboy that would get us into World War III, and he knew nothing about national politics. But we garnered strength in that campaign as we went along, and as you read in the book, I managed to come up with a phrase on October 7th in Langhorne, Pennsylvania at the Oxford Mall, and it went something like this: ask yourself, are you better off today than you were in 1976? And Reagan tweaked that a little bit along the road, and then used it in the debate against Carter in later in October and changed it to "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" And that changed the whole dynamic of the campaign. And Reagan was such a dream to work with. He was such a great communicator. He could sometimes we had 20, 30 minutes to write a speech on the plane in 1980, and he could just work that into his half sheets. And he never used a teleprompter. That's something that's going to come as a surprise to people. All the candidates today use teleprompters on the campaign trail. Reagan never used a teleprompter. He just spoke from these little half sheets, note cards that he'd stuff in his pocket, and then he'd pull them out and speak from those note cards.
I worked in the 1968 campaign in New York, essentially as a gopher for John Mitchell, who was Richard Nixon's law partner, later his attorney general. Very junior. I got to see former Vice President Nixon come and go. In 1972, I was the most junior person on his reelection. I got to shake his hand one time. It was not until 1979, when I was elected Young Republican National Chairman, that President Nixon invited me to San Clemente. You won't remember this, Ken, but you are the man who greeted me and told me that the president had a busy schedule, but that he was looking forward to seeing me. But you thought he might give me 45 minutes of his time. I ended up spending about 4 hours with him, and I think it's because of this. He asked me what kind of shape the party was in. I told him I thought we would win the election of 1980, and he said to me, well, surely John Connally will be our nominee. And I said, no, sir, he will not. He said, pardon me? I said, no, we're going to nominate Ronald Reagan. And I gave him all the reasons why. And then he said, by the way, are you free for lunch? And he had sandwiches brought in. It was a beginning of a great relationship. And then in 1980, our mutual friend Ed Rollins, since I was based in New York, working for the campaign as the Northeastern Regional Political Director, gave me the assignment of going out to Saddle River once a week to give the old man, as we called him, a briefing on everything. As you know, he had a voracious appetite for political intelligence, but also gossip. He loved politics. He also mixed a very, very mean martini, which he used to call a silver bullet. And most of our weekly sessions were at the end of the day on Friday. So it was then that I learned that, well, only after a couple of drinks did President Nixon become a bit more loquacious about the past. And I got the honor of asking him about Jack Kennedy and Eisenhower and getting stoned in Caracas and so on. People, I think, do not appreciate that Nixon was an introvert in an extrovert's business, while Reagan was the ultimate extrovert. I agree with your assessment in your book that Nixon had deep respect for Reagan. Reagan had stood by him on the Vietnam War and stood by him on Watergate. I think Nixon was always a bit, confused about the way Reagan made it all look so effortless. After all, Nixon had run for governor of California in 1962, been defeated by Pat Brown, which turned out, as you know, to be a blessing in disguise because it kept Nixon from the 1964 nomination, where he most likely would have lost after the assassination of John Kennedy. But then Reagan came back in 1966 and wins a solid victory against the same Brown. These men had a long relationship. Reagan actually would, I think, have become a Republican a little earlier, but in 1962, I think former Vice President Nixon asked Reagan to delay that because he thought Reagan's support as a Democrat for Nixon in the gubernatorial race was of greater value than Reagan's support would have been as a Republican. People don't understand the extent to which, unlike a lot of politicians today, these men were deeply involved themselves in everything they said and did. Talk to us about that.
Well, you certainly hit on a lot of things there. Beginning with the '84 campaign, when Nixon was advising Reagan. One of the big threads of this book, Roger, is one of the important threads of the book is how Nixon secretly advised Reagan in the 80 and 84 campaign and throughout his presidency. And when I joined the Reagan campaign in 80, Nixon saw the opportunity to have a courier, if you will, a secret agent, using me to transmit information to Reagan, first through the secret memos that first were transmitted through his chief of staff, Nick Ruey, given to me in secret meetings in New York, and then given over to Reagan in the campaign in 80. And then once again in 84, Nixon sent secret memos to Reagan, and then in phone calls to me throughout the campaign trail in 80 and 84. So they had an excellent relationship. And then when Reagan was in trouble in 85, in a big controversy in his first personal crisis, Nixon sent comforting memos to him. And then after the difficult debate in 84 when he lost to Mondale, in that first debate, Nixon sent memos comforting him and giving him strength. So it was an extraordinary relationship between the two men that nobody understood. And it was largely, they were first adversaries. And I'm going back to one point you made about John Connally. Nixon had a great admiration for Connally because Connally had a trait that Nixon thought Reagan didn't have, and that was the ability to throw a punch. And he was a strong personality. But Nixon underestimated Reagan in that way. But because when Reagan was backed into a corner, Reagan was able to throw a punch, and it was only after people thought Reagan couldn't be confrontational. He was always genial and such a nice fellow all the time. But when he got his dander up, when people went after him like Mondale did in 84 and said nasty things about him, or when Carter did in 80. Reagan could get feisty and fight back. So it was a really interesting combination of the two personalities. But when you say that, when they say that Nixon was an introvert in an extrovert's business, but I always tell people that Nixon was a real extrovert when you got him in a bunch of the company of people talking politics. He loved to talk politics with folks, and I didn't need one or two drinks with him. I didn't need any drinks with him to start talking about politics. He loved talking about politics, going back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, and you could get him talking about an obscure congressional district in Indiana and Charlie Halleck, or a senatorial race in the 50s with Thurston and Morton. And I mean, he was a fascinating character, Roger, wasn't he? I mean, you could get him to talk about Winston Churchill or Charles de Gaulle or Golda Meir. Nobody was more fascinating to have a conversation with. And that's all in my book. That's why I want people to read the book, is to see the combination of those two personalities.
The book again, folks, In Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon by Ken Khachigian. It's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop. You can get it at Target and Walmart. I can't put this book down. Of course, I'm a political junkie who worked for both Reagan and Nixon myself at different times. My experiences are very, very similar. I guess, Ken, what I was referring to is the fact is that both Reagan and Nixon, while they had excellent speechwriters, they would also work on their own speeches in public statements, that they were both perfectionists in that regard.
Absolutely. And Nixon especially... well, both of them, and I'm going to give you examples. When I worked as a speechwriter for Nixon, he never spoke from a text. And of all the rallies he did, we would give him suggested remarks and fact sheets. He would take those and the suggested remarks and fact sheets, and then he would study them, and then he would speak extemporaneously. So he not only did not use a teleprompter, he didn't use notes even when he would speak to political rallies or at commemorative occasions. And in Reagan's case, it would depend upon how much time he had. if Reagan had time, he loved to write his own speeches, and that came from the fact that when he was on the road for General Electric all those years, when he wrote all his own speeches and did all his own research. So if as long as President Reagan had the opportunity and the time, he would edit his speeches, he would work them over, and I tried not to be precious about my own writing, and the speechwriters, my speechwriting staff that I hired, I tried to tell them to put their egos aside because the president was the best speechwriter of them all.
Yeah, and of course, Reagan was also famous for working constantly on his famous index cards from which he spoke, but also very understanding of the written word and a perfectionist in his own right. I remember when he was asked at the end of his presidency whether a reporter asked him whether the fact that he had come from the world of show business, that he'd been an actor rather than a political, whether that had hampered his ability to be president. He said, no, actually, I don't see how a guy who wasn't an actor could do this job.
Yes, that's right.
When we come back, Ken Khachigian will tell us more about his unique experience with both presidents. So, folks, please don't go away.
It's the Roger Stone Show on 77 WABC. It's the Roger Stone Show on 77 WABC.
And we're back. Our guest, Ken Khachigian, who served as a trusted speechwriter, confidant, and strategist to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, also a key figure in the election of one of the last great governors of California, George Deukmejian, joins us to talk about his great book, In Behind Closed Doors, in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Ken, I'll tell you a story that President Reagan told me. He was running for governor in 1966, and he saw former Vice President Richard Nixon at the Bohemian Grove. And, of course, Nixon was not openly, but already plotting his own 1968 comeback. And he said, you know, Ron, in the race for governor in 62, they really skewered me because they thought that I would use the governorship as a stepping stone to run for president again. It was an issue that really hurt me. So I think it would really help your candidacy for governor of California this year if you would pledge that under no circumstances would you run for president in 1968. And Reagan thought about that and said, okay, Dick, I'll think about that, which, of course, he never did. People don't realize that in 1968, at the urging of Lynn Nofziger and Tom Reed, who was then a Reagan aide, Nixon did make a kind of a furtive last-minute bid for the 1968 nomination, did work with Cliff White and Nelson Rockefeller on the theory that if Nixon could be stopped on the first ballot, that the convention would turn to them. I was at that convention. Their commitments were to Richard Nixon, major conservatives, including Barry Goldwater, John Tower, Carl Curtis, Bill Buckley, and others. But the heart of that convention, even in 1968, belonged to Ronald Reagan. And that's why I thought he should run in 1976. Both of them giants that I think are unappreciated. I'm interested in the period of Watergate. I have concluded that based on a terrific book by Ray Locker, a USA Today reporter, I actually think to the extent that Deep Throat is one person, and I'm not sure they are because they're never mentioned in the Washington Post reporting by Woodward and Bernstein. So to a certain extent, I believe Deep Throat may be an amalgamation, but to a great extent, I actually think that General Alexander Haig was Deep Throat. And if you've read the book, Locker makes a very, very comprehensive case. I recommend it. I think Al Haig, who was Richard Nixon's final chief of staff, you were there. I was not. I was in the Young Republicans then. I remember the day of Nixon's resignation. I was at National Committee meeting in Reno, Nevada, and I couldn't stop crying. It was a horrific day, one of the worst days of my life. But those final days, Ken, you were one of those who was absolutely against resignation. You wanted Nixon to fight it out. Pat Buchanan, a small handful of others agreed with you. Others, as Pat would say, they ran for the tall grass. What was it like in that period, and what transpired?
Well, it was, as you read the book, Roger, it's the first chapter of my book. It's the opening of the book. I call it "The End is the Beginning," and it was a horrific period. It was the end of the 2 years of Watergate, of the establishment elite chasing Nixon out of office. They wanted his scalp. They'd been wanting his scalp since 1947. In 48, after he got Alger Hiss, their darling communist boy that he had gotten on perjury rap. So that first chapter documents the last, virtually the last 7 or 8 days of the Nixon presidency that I captured in day by day, hour by hour. I was on the anti-impeachment team, designated by Al Haig and Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, and Fred Bazard, the chief counsel, who came over from the Pentagon to be Nixon's chief counsel. And it was just extremely, we were going hour by hour overtime trying to capture a defense as the tapes were coming out, and as the Supreme Court ordered the tapes going over to the special prosecutor's office. And I thought we had a solid defense because it was a very partisan prosecution over at the prosecutor's office. They were all mostly Kennedy guys, virtually all Democrats, and coming out of the Kennedy administration. And of course, as we know now, discovered by my colleague Jeff Shepard, that Jack Sirica was a corrupt judge and had been meeting secretly with the prosecutors. Now, we didn't know that then. But even what we knew then, I still thought that the president should have fought it out, that because it had been a partisan case. And I said, was arguing, look, let's make our Republican friends and the Democrats, let's force their hand, make them take a vote, let's take the case to the Senate and fight it out. But you point out about Al Haig. I don't know what Al was doing, and at the very end, I know he was in communication with Jaworski a couple of times, the special prosecutor. Al was tired. I know he's concerned about his reputation, and everybody, a lot of people were tired of the fight of Watergate and wanted to get it over with. We were in a recession at the time. We had coming out of the Arab-Israeli war in the previous year, October of 73. We had the Arab oil embargo, so gas prices had gone up 35%. The country was angry, and so we're dealing with the rest of Congress. The Republicans in Congress were nervous about the upcoming midterm elections, and they're banging on Haig, and I think he just wanted out of this deal, and so I think he was to some extent greasing the skids, and if he could find a way out, I think that's part of what he wanted to do, and I know that as you read my book, you'll find that he counseled me as I was writing the final talking points in the cabinet meeting to not don't put a fighting defense in the talking points. Don't go to the mat. And I was 29 years old. I was just a young, just a young kid. And so as you read that chapter, you'll see the distress in my writing and the horrible pressure we were under at that time. And then when the final tape came out, the June 23rd tape, where we thought that it appeared that President Nixon was obstructing justice, and we had to cave it in. But then now, 50 years later, we've discovered that was not the case. That it was not a smoking gun. It was actually even John Dean said it was shooting blanks. I call it a water pistol. Had we known then what we know now, we could have fought, stayed and fought another day and survived that presidency, and Richard Nixon could have served out his term. So Roger was just a horrible, terrible time, and that last day in the East Room on August 8th, before that, as I say in the book, I wrote a memo to the president. I know he never saw it, but telling him not to quit. And then I took it to Rose Woods, and poor Rose was crying as she was typing the president's resignation speech. She was in tears, and I had to turn away. I just couldn't take it anymore, and so it was just a horrible, terrible time. I lost 20 pounds during that period, just with all the stress going on in our lives. It was, I can't tell you how difficult it was under the pressures we were dealing with.
Again, the book, folks, In Behind Closed Doors, in the Room with Reagan and Nixon, by White House advisor, speechwriter, strategist Ken Khachigian. You can get your copy at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, Target, Walmart. Thanks for joining us today on the Roger Stone Show here at 77 WABC Radio. And don't go away, because my good friend Joe Piscopo will be right along with Sundays with Sinatra.